August 1943. The steppe grass around Prokhorovka still smoldered, black smoke rising from hundreds of burned-out tanks. Soviet recovery crews moved through the battlefield, cataloguing the wreckage. German Panthers, Tigers, Panzer, some barely scratched, others blown inside out, their armor peeled back like tin cans. A young lieutenant from the Red Army's intelligence directorate crouched beside a destroyed Panther, running his hand along the serial number stamped into the hull. He copied it into his notebook, the 14th such number he'd recorded that morning. 300 kilometers to the east, in a Moscow office that smelled of tobacco and strong tea, Major General Fyodor Kuznetsov studied a growing pile of these serial numbers. Tank identification codes, unit markings, production stamps from German factories. Each piece of metal told a story, and the story they told together was beginning to change everything. The Battle of Kursk had ended 3 weeks earlier. The Germans had thrown nearly 3,000 tanks into their offensive, the largest concentration of armor the world had ever seen. They'd lost at least 760 tanks destroyed, hundreds more damaged beyond field repair. It was a staggering loss, the kind that would have crippled the Red Army just a year earlier. But Kuznetsov's analysis suggested something the frontline commanders hadn't yet grasped. The Germans couldn't afford these losses anymore, not the way they once could. Kuznetsov had been tracking German tank production since 1941. Back then, Soviet intelligence estimated Germany produced around 3,800 tanks per year. Impressive, but not overwhelming. The Soviets had lost more than that in the first month of Barbarossa, alone, and kept fighting. By 1942, German production had increased to roughly 6,200 tanks. Still manageable, given Soviet production was climbing toward 24,000 that same year. But the numbers Kuznetsov was seeing now told a different story. The serial numbers from Kursk, cross-referenced with captured production documents and reports from Soviet agents inside Germany, revealed something crucial. Yes, German tank production was still increasing. Estimates suggested they'd build around 12,000 tanks in 1943. But the nature of that production had changed. A junior analyst entered Kuznetsov's office, carrying a decoded message from the Lucy spy ring in Switzerland. The intelligence network, which had proven remarkably accurate about German plans, had obtained production figures from contacts inside German industry. Kuznetsov read the report twice, then reached for his telephone. This needed to go directly to the top. In his office in the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin sat behind his desk, a map of the Eastern Front spread before him. He'd been studying it for hours, planning the autumn offensives. When his aide announced that Kuznetsov was requesting an urgent briefing, Stalin waved him in immediately. Intelligence about German capabilities always took priority. Kuznetsov laid out his findings with the precision of a man who knew his life depended on accuracy. The German tank force, he explained, was experiencing a crisis that wasn't immediately visible from the battlefield. Yes, they were producing more tanks than ever, but they were losing them faster than they could train crews to replace them. A Tiger tank took months to build. A crew that could use it effectively took years to train. At Kursk, Germany had lost not just machines, but irreplaceable veterans. Stalin listened without interrupting, his pipe forgotten in the ashtray. Kuznetsov continued. Soviet agents reported that German tank factories were struggling with raw material shortages. Chrome for armor plate, molybdenum for gun barrels, rubber for road wheels, all increasingly scarce as Allied bombing intensified and Germany's access to imports shrank. The tanks rolling off production lines in late 1943 were using substitute materials, inferior alloys, simplified designs. They looked like Panthers and Tigers, but they broke down more often. Their armor was softer, their engines less reliable. More critically, Kuznetsov explained, Germany was now fighting a multi-front war. Every tank sent to Italy was one less available for the Eastern Front. Every Panzer division held in France against the anticipated Allied invasion was one that couldn't stop the Red Army. The strategic reserve of armored formations that had allowed Germany to plug gaps and launch counter-offensives was being consumed faster than it could be rebuilt. Stalin stood and walked to the map. His finger traced the front line from Leningrad to the Black Sea. For 2 years, the pattern had been the same. Soviet offensives would advance, then German armored counterattacks would restore the line. The Tiger and Panther tanks, introduced earlier that year, had seemed to confirm German technical superiority. Each one could destroy multiple Soviet T-34s in a straight fight. But Kuznetsov's analysis suggested that technical superiority didn't matter anymore. The mathematics had shifted. Soviet factories were producing 28,000 tanks in 1943 alone. Even if each German tank destroyed 3 Soviet tanks before being knocked out, the numbers didn't work. The Red Army could afford those losses. Germany couldn't. Stalin asked the question that mattered most: when would Germany run out of armored reserves? Kuznetsov's answer was precise. Based on current loss rates and production capacity, Germany's strategic armored reserve, the pool of tanks and trained crews available for counter-offensives, would be effectively exhausted by spring of 1944. After that, every tank destroyed would create a hole in the line that couldn't be filled. The implications were staggering. For the first time since 1941, the Red Army could plan operations without fear of devastating German armored counterattacks. The beast that had nearly destroyed the Soviet Union was running out of teeth. Stalin returned to his desk and pulled out a calendar. Operation Bagration, the massive offensive against Army Group Center, was already in preliminary planning. He'd been cautious about the timeline, knowing that German armored reserves could turn any breakthrough into a disaster. But if Kuznetsov was right, and Stalin's instinct told him he was, then the entire strategic calculation changed. Over the next 3 days, Stalin called a series of meetings with his senior commanders. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the architect of Soviet victories at Moscow and Stalingrad, arrived first. Stalin shared Kuznetsov's analysis, watching Zhukov's face as the implications sank in. The Marshal had spent 2 years fighting German armor, respecting its power even as he learned to defeat it. The idea that this threat was diminishing seemed almost too good to believe, but the evidence was undeniable. Zhukov had noticed it himself in recent operations. German counterattacks were smaller, less coordinated, launched with fewer tanks. Prisoners reported fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, replacement crews with minimal training. The Germans were still dangerous, still capable of inflicting terrible casualties, but they were no longer the seemingly unstoppable force of 1941. Stalin outlined his new strategic vision. The Red Army would maintain continuous offensive pressure, never allowing the Germans time to rebuild their armored reserves. Multiple, simultaneous operations across the entire front would force Germany to disperse its dwindling tank forces, preventing concentration for effective counterattacks. The goal wasn't just to push the Germans back. It was to destroy their ability to resist. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, commander of the Central Front, raised a practical concern. Continuous offensive operations would strain Soviet logistics and wear down their own tank forces. Stalin's response was blunt. Soviet tank production was outpacing German production by more than 2 to 1. The Red Army could afford to trade tanks. Germany couldn't. Every German tank destroyed was irreplaceable. Every Soviet tank destroyed would be replaced within weeks. The strategy Stalin outlined that autumn would define Soviet operations for the rest of the war. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, would demonstrate its effectiveness. The Red Army committed over 5,000 tanks and self-propelled guns to the offensive. The Germans, unable to concentrate sufficient armor to stop the breakthrough, watched Army Group Center disintegrate. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed. The few German armored units available were ground down in futile counterattacks, their losses impossible to replace. But the roots of this strategy traced back to those August days in 1943, when Stalin first grasped that Germany's armored strength was an illusion. The tanks were still formidable, still deadly, but finite. Every Tiger destroyed at Kursk was one less available for the next battle. Every experienced crew lost couldn't be replaced by hastily trained recruits. Stalin understood something that many German commanders refused to accept. Modern armored warfare wasn't just about the quality of individual tanks. It was about the industrial capacity to replace losses, the training infrastructure to produce competent crews, the logistics network to keep tanks fueled and maintained, the strategic depth to absorb defeats and rebuild. Germany had lost all of these advantages by late 1943. They just didn't know it yet. The intelligence reports kept coming throughout the autumn. Soviet agents in Germany reported chaos in tank production facilities. Allied bombing raids were disrupting supply chains. The loss of chromium imports from Turkey was forcing German metallurgists to use inferior steel alloys. Tank engines were failing after a fraction of their designed operational life. New crews were being sent to the front with as little as 4 weeks of training, compared to the 6-month standard earlier in the war. By November, when Stalin met with Roosevelt and Churchill at the Tehran conference, his confidence was unmistakable. The Western Allies were still planning their cross-channel invasion, worried about German armored reserves in France. Stalin assured them that Germany's armor was a declining asset. Every month that passed, every battle fought, weakened the German tank force beyond recovery. The Red Army would maintain pressure in the east, preventing any significant transfer of German armor to face the Allied invasion. Stalin's words to Roosevelt were characteristically blunt. The Germans, he said, had made a fatal error at Kursk. They'd committed their strategic reserve in a gamble to regain the initiative, and they'd lost. Now they were fighting a war of attrition they couldn't win. Soviet intelligence indicated that German tank production, while still substantial, couldn't keep pace with losses across multiple fronts. The Wehrmacht was being forced to strip training units, cannibalize damaged tanks for parts, and deploy new formations before they were combat-ready. Roosevelt asked about the new German heavy tanks, the Tigers and Panthers that had caused such concern among Allied planners. Stalin's response revealed his understanding of the strategic situation. Yes, he acknowledged, these tanks were formidable in combat. A single Tiger could destroy multiple Allied tanks in a direct engagement, but this technical superiority was irrelevant. Germany didn't have enough Tigers to matter. Soviet intelligence estimated total Tiger production at around 1,300 tanks for all of 1943. The Red Army had lost more tanks than that in a single month during Barbarossa, and survived. Germany couldn't afford to lose 1,300 Tigers. Each one destroyed was a strategic loss. The mathematics, Stalin explained, were simple. Soviet factories would produce approximately 28,000 tanks in 1943. American factories would produce approximately 29,000. British factories would add another 7,000. Against this combined production of 64,000 tanks, Germany would produce 12,000. Even assuming German tanks were superior in quality, which Stalin disputed, the numbers made German defeat inevitable. But Stalin's insight went deeper than simple production figures. He understood that Germany's real crisis wasn't the number of tanks, but the system that supported them. A tank without fuel was a pillbox. A tank without spare parts was scrap metal. A tank without a trained crew was a death trap. Germany was running short of all three. Soviet intelligence reported that German tank units were operating at 60 to 70% of authorized strength, not because tanks weren't available, but because fuel allocations had been cut. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, Germany's primary fuel source, were under constant Allied bombing. Synthetic fuel production was insufficient to meet demand. German tank divisions were being forced to choose which operations to fuel, leaving portions of their strength immobile. The spare parts situation was even worse. German tanks used dozens of specialized components that required precision manufacturing. Ball bearings, transmission gears, engine parts, all were becoming scarce as Allied bombing disrupted production. Soviet agents reported that German maintenance units were cannibalizing 3 damaged tanks to keep one operational. The theoretical strength of German armored divisions bore little relation to the number of tanks they could actually field. And the crew problem was unsolvable. Training a tank crew required time, fuel for exercises, ammunition for practice, and experienced instructors. Germany was short of all 4. New crews were being rushed to the front with minimal training. Often their first combat experience was also their last. The veterans who'd conquered France and driven to the gates of Moscow were dead, captured, or scattered across multiple fronts. Their replacements couldn't match their skill, and there was no time to teach them. Stalin grasped that this combination of factors meant Germany's armored strength would decline steadily, regardless of production numbers. Every battle consumed not just tanks, but the irreplaceable infrastructure of expertise, logistics, and industrial capacity that made armored warfare possible. The Red Army, by contrast, was growing stronger. Soviet tank crews were gaining experience. Soviet logistics were improving. Soviet production was accelerating. In December 1943, Stalin approved the operational plans for 1944. The strategy was aggressive to the point of recklessness by earlier standards. 10 major offensive operations across the entire front, each designed to prevent German recovery and force the dispersal of armored reserves. The Leningrad-Novgorod offensive would begin in January, the Korsun-Cherkasy offensive in February, the Crimean offensive in April, Operation Bagration in June, the Lvov-Sandomierz offensive in July. Each operation would grind down German armor, forcing Germany to commit its dwindling reserves to stop breakthroughs. The German response proved Stalin's analysis correct. Unable to concentrate sufficient armor at any single point, German commanders were forced into a defensive strategy that consumed their tank forces piecemeal. Counterattacks that might have been decisive with adequate armored support failed for lack of tanks. Breakthroughs that should have been contained widened into disasters because no mobile reserves existed to plug the gaps. By spring of 1944, the pattern was unmistakable. German armored divisions that had begun the year with 200 tanks were operating with 70 or 80. Units designated as Panzer divisions had fewer tanks than Soviet rifle divisions. The term armored reserve became meaningless. There were no reserves. Every available tank was committed to the front line, struggling to contain multiple Soviet offensives. The intelligence summaries crossing Stalin's desk in May 1944 confirmed the transformation. German tank losses in the first 5 months of the year exceeded 12,000 vehicles. Production for the same period was approximately 8,000. The gap was being filled by stripping training units, repairing previously written-off wrecks, and deploying new production directly to the front without the usual period of unit formation and training. Stalin ordered Operation Bagration to proceed as planned. The offensive, targeting the German Army Group Center in Belarus, would commit the Red Army's largest concentration of armor since Kursk. Over 5,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, supported by massive artillery and air power, would strike simultaneously across a 400-kilometer front. German intelligence detected the buildup but lacked the armored reserves to respond effectively. When Bagration began on June 23, 1944, the German defense collapsed within days. Soviet tank columns punched through German lines and drove deep into the rear, encircling entire armies. German commanders frantically called for armored counterattacks, but the tanks didn't exist. The few Panzer divisions available were ground down in futile attempts to contain the breakthrough. Within 5 weeks, Army Group Center had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The Germans lost approximately 400,000 men and hundreds of tanks they couldn't replace. Stalin's strategic insight had proven devastatingly correct. Germany's inability to replace its armored losses had transformed the character of the war. The Wehrmacht, once defined by its mobile armored warfare, was reduced to static defense. The Red Army, once forced to trade space for time against German tank offensives, now drove westward with unstoppable momentum. The implications extended beyond the Eastern Front. When the Western Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, they faced fewer German armored divisions than expected. The divisions that were present were under strength, equipped with a mixture of outdated and new tanks, manned by inexperienced crews. The German armored reserve that might have driven the invasion back into the sea had been consumed in Russia, ground down in the attritional warfare that Stalin had deliberately sustained. By autumn 1944, German tank production had actually increased to its wartime peak, approximately 19,000 tanks for the year, but the increase was meaningless. Losses exceeded production by a widening margin. The Red Army was destroying German tanks faster than German factories could build them, while simultaneously advancing toward those same factories. Allied bombing was reducing production capacity. Raw material shortages were worsening. The transportation network was collapsing under sustained air attack. Stalin's intelligence briefings in late 1944 painted a picture of total German collapse. Tank units were being formed, equipped, and destroyed within weeks. New Panthers and Tigers were being abandoned for lack of fuel before firing a shot in combat. Crew training had been reduced to 2 weeks, barely enough time to learn basic operation, let alone combat tactics. German armored divisions existed in name only, their actual combat power a fraction of their paper strength. The final confirmation of Stalin's analysis came during the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945. Soviet forces advanced from the Vistula River to within 70 kilometers of Berlin in 3 weeks, covering over 600 kilometers. German armored counterattacks, once capable of stopping or at least slowing such advances, were barely noticeable. The few tank units available were swept aside or bypassed. The Red Army had become an unstoppable armored steamroller, and Germany lacked the means to stop it. Stalin's realization in August 1943 that Germany couldn't replace its tank losses had led directly to the strategic approach that won the war in the East. By maintaining continuous offensive pressure, the Red Army had prevented German recovery and accelerated the collapse of German armored strength. The beast that had nearly destroyed the Soviet Union in 1941 had been systematically dismantled, ground down through attrition that Germany's industrial base couldn't sustain. In his office in the Kremlin, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin in April 1945, Stalin reviewed the intelligence summaries one final time. German tank production for the first quarter of 1945 had collapsed to fewer than 1,000 vehicles. The factories were being overrun, the supply chains destroyed, the training grounds captured. The German armored force that had conquered most of Europe's had been reduced to scattered remnants, fighting with obsolete equipment and untrained crews. Stalin's statement to his commanders in those final weeks was characteristically direct. The Germans, he said, had lost the war the moment they lost the ability to replace their tanks. Everything since Kursk had been inevitable. The Red Army hadn't just defeated German armor, it had systematically destroyed Germany's capacity to produce, maintain, and operate armored forces. The technical superiority of individual German tanks was irrelevant when those tanks couldn't be replaced, couldn't be fueled, couldn't be crewed by trained personnel. The lessons Stalin drew from this experience would shape Soviet military doctrine for decades. Victory in modern war, he concluded, didn't belong to the side with the best tanks. It belonged to the side that could produce enough adequate tanks, train enough competent crews, and sustain enough fuel and spare parts to keep fighting. Quality mattered, but quantity and sustainability mattered more. Germany had learned this lesson too late. The Soviet Union had learned it in time to win.